In the 20-plus years of the Halo franchise, there is one enemy that every fan can agree stands apart from all others, with that, of course, being the Flood. And while they may have had limited appearances across the games, that barely scratches the surface of their true footprint within the Halo timeline, as their legacy is one that stretches back over 10 million years before the Master Chief even stepped foot on a Halo ring. And if you've been with the channel for a long time, this intro might sound pretty similar to one of the very first lore videos that I ever made here on YouTube, which was a deep dive into the ancient history of the Flood. But a lot of new lore has been revealed since then, and honestly, it's long past time that we revisited the Parasite's story, not just their ancient beginnings, but their impact on the modern era of Halo as well. And today's video is going to be a long one, so let's not waste any more time and dive right in. Existing long before humanity, the Covenant, and even the Forerunners, there once lived a race known as the Precursors. These ancient godlike beings practiced a belief known as the Mantle of Responsibility, a sacred duty to cultivate and protect all living things. And when they first entered the Milky Way galaxy over 10 million years ago, they used their endless wisdom and advanced technologies to seed countless worlds with life, giving rise to a vast array of intelligent species. Some of the most promising among them would be the Forerunners and humanity. The Precursors had hoped to pass on the mantle to one of their creations one day, and in time concluded that humanity, rather than the Forerunners, would be their successors. But the Forerunners, unable to accept their creator's judgment, turned against them, taking them completely by surprise. Despite being significantly more advanced, the Precursors were not inherently a militaristic species, which left them vulnerable and all but helpless against the Forerunners' assault. This war would quickly become a mass genocide of their species, almost pushing them to extinction. However, a handful of Precursors survived and were able to flee to the edges of the galaxy and beyond. But some of these survivors did not want to abandon their duty to the galaxy entirely, and these individuals used their species' unique transmorphic abilities to enter into a state of suspended animation in hopes that in time they could return to a galaxy in peace. In doing this, they turned themselves into a dust-like substance which would remain inside of glass cylinders aboard their ships for millions of years. However, over the many eons of waiting, the biological structure of this organic dust would degrade, and in turn became corrupted. Around the year of 107,445 BCE, nearly 10 million years after the Forerunners' genocide, the ships that held the powdered remains of the surviving Precursors had begun to fail. They then crashed into several worlds across the borders of intergalactic space and were soon discovered by ancient humanity and their allies at the time, the Sanshayum. Inside, they found millions of vials of this now corrupted powder, completely unaware of its true nature. But after careful analysis, it was determined that the substance was indeed organic, non-harmful, and would induce psychotropic effects when fed to lower animal species, such as the ancient dog-like pet species, the Feru. And due to this docile behavior that they exhibited, the powder was distributed for widespread use. However, it would go unrealized that this corrupted substance was beginning to slowly alter the genetic code of the creatures that consumed it. After many centuries, these changes to their genome finally became apparent, manifesting as fleshy protrusions and furry growths which other animals were compelled to consume, causing them to become sick and diseased. And despite several attempts to stem the further spread of this disease, any humans or Sanshayum who had come into contact with these altered Feru began to exhibit the same symptoms. And as their psychological state began to deteriorate, they too felt the same compulsion to consume the diseased Feru, further spreading the infection through direct contact. Any tissue, blood, or discarded limb from an infected host acted as a vector for the infection of new victims. Entire populations fell into a cycle of madness and cannibalism, performing ritualistic sacrifices in which infected individuals were allowed to grow grotesquely large before being consumed alive by the uninfected. And it was at this point that the Flood began manifesting into what we know them as today, with those who were infected beginning to transform into horrid amalgamations of flesh and bone that were designed to gather victims, engage in combat, or rapidly consume biomass and other valued resources. This was the true beginnings of the Flood. In an attempt to prevent the Flood from infecting the entire galaxy, ancient humanity took it upon themselves to sterilize any world that it spread to, including those controlled by a species with whom they had a tenuous peace, the Forerunners. But with no time for delay, Forthan Cho, commander of the human fleets, chose not to warn the Forerunners of the advancing Flood, not wanting to risk precious time of it spreading further. However, the Forerunners interpreted their actions as aggression, and so began the Human Forerunner War. As humanity began to show signs of wear from the Forerunners' response, the Flood appeared to pull its attention away from them, focusing all of their efforts on the Forerunners. Surprisingly, the Forerunners then began to gain ground against the parasite, and when they ventured into sectors heavily controlled by it, they discovered a number of healthy human-occupied worlds being completely ignored by the Flood. This led some to believe that humanity had developed a resistance or even a cure to the parasite, though it was speculated by the leader of the Forerunner military, the Ur-Didact, that the Flood did this as a strategic ploy, hoping that the Forerunners would not completely wipe out the humans. In time, the scales began to tip in the Forerunners' favor, with the Flood retreating to the edges of the galaxy to regroup, leaving a weakened humanity to the full force of the Forerunners' wrath. And after many years of combating the Flood, the Forerunners, and the betrayal from their allies the Sanshayum, humanity had been pushed to their limits. So, following the siege of their capital world, Cheremakor, they surrendered. And as reparations for their actions, humanity would be devolved into a primitive state, with their history and achievements also erased from the galaxy. They were then exiled to their species' homeworld of Erde Tyrene, or as we know it, Earth, and began to live under the watchful eye of the Lifeworker, the Librarian, who still saw much potential in them. But back on Cheremakor, the Forerunners had discovered an ancient stasis capsule that held a being known as the Primordial, who was later revealed to be the last known living precursor in existence. The Ur-Didact chose to visit this creature personally, and during its interrogation, the Primordial would tell him about the Forerunners' long-forgotten genocide of its species. Now, while the Didact did return and inform others of the existence of this ancient being, he chose not to share their bloody history with their species, out of fear that it would destabilize the Forerunner morale. But with the Flood threat now believed to be gone, and the humans no longer their rival, the Forerunners moved into an era of expansion. But they quickly began to disagree on how to prepare for future threats or the potential reemergence of the Flood. So, two options would be proposed: the Halo Array superweapon, championed by the Builder Rate, and the creation of planet-sized fortresses called Shield Worlds, which would act as a base of operations for precision military campaigns, this option being spearheaded by the Didact. The Halo Array concept would ultimately win, and this would cause a massive political shift and a change in the power structure of Forerunner leadership. This changing of hands would lead members of the military such as the Didact himself to either go into a voluntary self-exile or enter the ranks of Builder security. Though not all Forerunners would downplay the threat that the Flood posed, and in turn, the threat that the Halo Array posed to sentient life. So the Lifeworker Rate of the Forerunners began a conservation measure, conducting further research of the Flood while also cataloging and preserving the galaxy's many species aboard a number of facilities related to the Halo Array. But with this shift in priorities and a lack of a proper military presence, the Forerunners were incredibly unprepared for the reemergence of the Flood on the planet of Seaward, and in the time since their disappearance, they had become an even more deadly enemy, now demonstrating strategic planning. This was due to the emergence of a new type of Flood form: grave mines, massive amalgamations of biomass that acted as a central intelligence for a collective consciousness shared across the entirety of the Flood. Now returning with overwhelming numbers and this major advancement, there was little that the Forerunners could do to halt its progression. In many last-ditch efforts, some would use localized weapons of mass destruction, have entire Forerunner armadas carry out complete planetary bombardment, or would even consider sending stars into premature supernova. But one thing was clear now: all options would likely require the sacrifice of billions of lives, yet it would all be done in hopes of slowing the Flood. As the situation across the galaxy only seemed to worsen, work on the Halo Array would near completion, with a set of 12 massive ring-shaped installations being manufactured around the year of 98,445 BCE. And one of these halos, known as Installation 07, would be taken to the planet of Cheremakor for testing by the Contender-class AI Mendicant Bias. And upon firing, it would reveal that the ring's halo effect was not only capable of destroying the neurological structure within life forms, but also the complete destruction of artifacts of neural physics, the theoretical science by which all precursor technologies and artifacts functioned. And as a result of the firing, the time-lock prison holding the Primordial on the planet below had broken, which prompted the creature's transfer to Installation 07. The Precursor would remain on the ring for the next 43 years, and during that time, it would communicate with Mendicant Bias. Eventually, the AI would succumb to the Primordial's persuasion and turned against its creators. This rampancy would be known as the first case of the Logic Plague, and the main problem with this was that Mendicant Bias held control over the Forerunners' vast military assets, which it intended to use against them. Though the consequences of Mendicant Bias's defection were costly, in time, the AI and Primordial were both contained. The ISO Didact would then travel to Installation 07, convening with the Precursor one last time. And during this conversation, it revealed 3 things. 1, the unifying purpose of the Flood. 2, that humanity was originally destined to inherit the mantle of responsibility. And 3, that the Precursors and the Flood were one and the same. When they concluded their conversation, the Isodidact used the stasis chamber which held the prisoner to kill it, causing its body to experience billion years of decay in a matter of seconds. While not intended, the death of the Primordial allowed its consciousness to join that of the Flood's collective one, causing its intelligence to increase tenfold. The repercussions of this would be realized when the Didact was later held prisoner by a Gravemind who shared this information with him, and after having inflicted unspeakable horrors on him as revenge for the actions of the Isodidact, he was eventually released, with the Flood anticipating that, in his broken and maddened state, he would cause chaos amongst the Forerunners' ranks in the coming years. During the final decade of the Forerunner-Flood War, the Flood grew to unfathomable numbers and strength, due in part to them changing their strategy. Instead of directly engaging Forerunner fleets, they would target densely populated worlds and focus on infection. And the reason for this was that the Flood had begun converting entire planetary biospheres into keymines, which were the product of converting the biomass of all terrestrial life forms into one single body. These would act as strategic processing points, pushing the intelligence and computational power of the Flood far beyond the Forerunners' capabilities. Alongside this, the logic plague was beginning to greatly hinder Forerunner defense measures, as their society relied heavily on the use of AI automation for combat. But the most disturbing revelation was that the Flood was now able to access ancient Precursor technologies, primarily their transgalactic megastructures called star roads, which allowed them to travel across the galaxy with alarming efficiency. This, paired with the presence of multiple Flood keymines, could hinder Forerunner slipspace travel due to the Flood's manipulation of space itself. These star roads could also be weaponized, as they were used by the Flood to destroy the original Ark, the location where the Halo rings had been manufactured, and before long, 11 of the 12 rings had also been destroyed in various conflicts, with Installation 07 being the only one to survive. But with every other countermeasure having failed, the only plausible option left was the Halo Array. So they began construction of a new Ark, the Lesser Ark, which quickly produced a new set of Halos. But in the midst of this, the Didact was attempting to create a solution of his own. Having been broken by the Gravemind many years before, the Didact abandoned all previous logic and sought any means to make the Forerunners immune to the Flood parasite. One solution that he had proposed would be the Prometheans of Requiem. He believed that the Prometheans of the Forerunner's warrior servant rate and all Forerunners in theory could be immunized by transferring their consciousness to mechanized bodies. These bodies would then contain the digitally composed essence of a Forerunner, which could then later be returned to an organic form once the Flood had been completely eradicated. But much like it was seen with the corruption of the Precursor's remains, these composed individuals would be incapable of returning to their previous organic state, though this fact he ignored. Now, it's also important to note that at this point in history, the Builder Rate had been removed from power, the Warrior Servants reinstated, and the Isodidact had taken the place of the Didact on the Council during his absence. So, given his radical ideas and the fact that his word did not carry the same authority it did many millennia before, the Didact's ideas would go unsupported. But he would move forward with his plans regardless, and utilizing an experimental device known as the Composer, he converted his remaining followers, as well as ancient humans, to power his non-biological Prometheans. And while they might have been effective, these soldiers saw little deployment against the Flood before the Didact was subdued by his wife, the Librarian, and imprisoned on Requiem for his actions against ancient humans. His creations were then tasked with protecting his cryptum, and they were more or less lost to time until their rediscovery many years later. After much political disagreement over the ethical implications, the Halo Array would finally be activated by the Isodidact in the year 97,445 BCE. Having been strategically positioned across the galaxy, this new set of 7 Halo rings went off simultaneously, sending a shockwave across all known space, killing all life with a nervous system, therefore killing any host and food source for the Flood. Though the Flood was not completely eradicated, as in an effort to prepare for the future, some Flood specimens were kept in storage on Halo rings, shield worlds, or other Forerunner installations for further study, but any Flood outside of containment would die out soon enough. But with the threat of the Flood now gone, a plan many years in the making was set in motion by the Librarian and the few surviving Forerunners, which saw to the reseeding of the galaxy's many species. And then, after ensuring that these reseeding efforts had been successful, these last surviving Forerunners sent themselves into exile. Some had chosen to leave the Milky Way galaxy altogether in search of a new home, while others abandoned their advanced technologies and lived out their final days in a primitive lifestyle. But in hopes of making amends for their mistakes, the Forerunners chose humanity as the heirs to their technology and passed along to them the mantle of responsibility. Nearly 100,000 years would pass, and the flood threat would continue to remain virtually non-existent. That is, except for the occasional outbreaks caused by the Covenant while exploring Forerunner structures, or if the countermeasures and failsafe systems in these holding facilities would fail altogether. The latter was the case on the shield world known as Trove, whose countermeasures had failed catastrophically. In 2531, humanity would unknowingly stumble upon this outbreak while following a distress signal from Professor Ellen Anders, who had just been captured by the Covenant and taken to the shield world. Here they would engage with some of the Covenant's forces and then fall under attack by the parasite. Further investigation of the signal revealed the presence of a proto-gravemind that was replicating Anders' signal in order to lure in new potential hosts. This proto-gravemind was then promptly neutralized by UNSC forces and Spartan II Red Team, but this triggered the Flood to retaliate and launch a massive assault on the UNSC Spirit of Fire's ground troops. And while the Flood had hoped to convert them before they escaped the shield world, the platoons were successfully extracted before their firebase was overrun. After reacquiring Anders' actual signal, the Spirit of Fire's crew then journeyed deeper into the shield world's interior and were quickly set upon by more of the Flood's forces. Luckily, the local sentinels and shield's defense system quickly deployed to cleanse the surface of the ship. When they arrived at the interior of the planet, they found the Flood's presence to be minimal and were able to quickly locate and rescue Anders. Shortly after this, the Spirit of Fire would choose to sacrifice its slipspace reactor and use it to induce the shield's artificial sun into going supernova. They did this to prevent the Covenant from seizing control of an ancient armada of Forerunner ships within the planet, and the resulting explosion completely destroyed it, the Forerunner ships, Covenant forces, and the Flood infestation. Fast forward to 2537, 6 years after the UNSC Spirit of Fire neutralized the Flood outbreak on Trove, it would become apparent that the Flood was not entirely contained, as a single pod infector would reveal itself, seemingly having managed to remain hidden aboard the ship despite sterilization protocols. And while most of the crew was still in cryo, as without the slipspace drive the ship was forced to travel at sublight speeds, a single maintenance engineer had been awoken by the ship's AI Serena to perform routine maintenance. The pod infector was able to locate this engineer and was able to successfully infect her. Serena then quarantined this combat form to the cryo bay, which over the course of the next few days began to transform itself into a carrier form. And due to the host's specialized knowledge of the cryo chambers, this Flood form was able to input the necessary codes to prematurely awaken other members of the crew, who were all quickly infected. Serena then had no choice but to wake up Professor Ellen Anders, which also triggered the awakening of Spartan II Jerome 092. Working together, Jerome was able to arm himself and defeat the majority of the infected, with the remaining enemies being vented into space. And once all traces of the Flood were cleansed from the ship, the two went back into cryo. This would be the definitive end to the Trove outbreak, and the Flood would not be seen again for almost 2 decades. In the year 2552, the Halo ring classified as Installation 04 would be revealed to the galaxy following the UNSC Pillar of Autumn's blind slipspace jump to its coordinates, the ship having done so to escape the Covenant's invasion of Reach and evade the pursuing fleet of Particular Justice. After UNSC forces evacuated their ship, it would crash land onto the surface, and the Covenant quickly worked to establish a ground presence on the ring, and it was not long before they uncovered a hidden Forerunner facility, and completely unaware of its true purpose as a Flood containment site, established it as a base of operations. Then, at some point, whether it be attributed to a containment failure or due to Covenant error, Flood forms escaped their stasis chambers and attacked the Covenant soldiers within the facility. Having a limited understanding of the parasite, these troops then sealed the complex and evacuated. However, the outbreak had already begun. Completely unaware of the outbreak, Captain Jacob Keyes and a team of human survivors infiltrated this facility, believing it to be a Covenant weapons cache. And when communications with the captain was lost, Spartan II John 117 was dispatched to investigate. After recovering footage from one of the deceased Marine's helmets, he discovered that the team had been overwhelmed and consumed by this new, terrifying enemy. After battling his way through the Flood in the facility, the Master Chief resurfaced and encountered the installation's monitor 343 Guilty Spark, who recruited him to help put an end to this infestation. He was then transported to a Forerunner structure known as the Library, and tasked with recovering an item known as the Activation Index, the key needed to activate the Halo and eradicate the Flood. Unbeknownst to the Spartan, he was not the first human to be given this task, however, because after fighting his way through hordes of Flood, he discovered the remains of Staff Sergeant Marvin Mabuto. This Marine had been found by Guilty Spark at some point following the rescue of UNSC forces from the Truth and Reconciliation, and then given the same mission of locating the Index. And despite not having super soldier augmentations, Mabuto fought his way through an impressive number of Flood forces before eventually succumbing to injury, with his body being so mangled that not even the Flood could use it. The Spartan eventually located the Index and then journeyed to the ring's control room. And just moments before he was tricked into initiating the firing sequence of the ring, believing it would deploy the ring's defenses, he was stopped by his AI companion Cortana, as she had just learned that the firing of the ring would kill all life in the blast radius, including John and the UNSC forces. The Monitor then attempted to stop the Chief from thwarting his plans, but failed, and after fighting through more of the Flood's forces, he was able to escape. Around this same time, the Flood had captured a Covenant Spirit dropship and crashed it into the agricultural support ship Infinite Succor. Here, the infection overwhelmed its crew and livestock, forcing Supreme Commander Thalvadami to deploy Ratas Fadumi's Special Operations Team, and they were ultimately successful in regaining control of the ship's navigation and programmed it to make a slipspace jump directly into the Soel system star. In the days that followed, the Flood spread across Alpha Halo and overwhelmed Covenant forces, and then the UNSC not long after. But their presence was only discovered when an ODST force engaged with the Covenant near Alpha Base and were then ambushed by the Flood. In the aftermath of this battle, one of these attacking combat forms was captured and identified to be Private First Class Wallace A. Jenkins, one of the Marines deployed to investigate the supposed Covenant weapons cache. It would come to be learned that he was indeed a host to the parasite, but because of the pod infector's weakened state after millennia at stasis, Jenkins' transformation into a combat form was incomplete, with him still maintaining consciousness and, although incapable of properly speaking, was able to communicate through hand gestures. So, during an interrogation with Major Antonio Silva, he was able to inform the UNSC Marine Battalion that the Flood were planning an assault on Alpha Base. This intelligence was instrumental in shutting down the attack, but at the same time, the Flood infestation was only getting worse as the Ring's defenses were failing to contain them. The Flood had also changed their priorities, setting their sights on the Covenant cruiser Truth and Reconciliation. Here they amassed their forces and absorbed the recently captured Captain Keyes into a developing proto-gravemind aboard the ship. The Flood then attempted to extract the location of Earth from his memories, but Keyes was able to resist their influence until he was killed by the Master Chief. Soon after this, the UNSC were able to take control of the ship and made the necessary repairs to use it to return back to Earth. But it was determined that if the Flood were able to escape, it could bring about the downfall of humanity. So, defying orders, a First Lieutenant Melissa McKay chose to destroy the ship instead. This did indeed kill the Flood on board, but also every other member of UNSC personnel. With the Truth and Reconciliation destroyed, the Flood then moved their forces to the Pillar of Autumn's crash site to acquire a new method of space travel. But before the infestation could take control of the ship, the Master Chief initiated its self-destruct sequence, and when the reactors blew, the resulting explosion destroyed it and caused the Ring to break apart, both crippling the installation's ability to fire and seemingly destroying the Flood threat. But of course, as is a recurring theme with the Flood, the outbreak here was not completely eradicated. Shortly after the destruction of Installation 04 in October of 2552, the human prison vessel Mona Lisa entered the Soel system and recovered surviving Flood specimen from the Ring's remains. And then, under the guidance of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the crew began using human and Covenant prisoners to study the effects of the parasite. But of course, containment eventually failed, the Flood gained control of the ship and assimilated its crew and test subjects. The UNSC Red Horse and a contingent of Marines were then sent in to investigate the fate of the Mona Lisa, unaware of the Flood's presence. The parasite then claimed member after member of the team until it was eventually discovered that a new proto-gravemind was forming in the engineering section of the ship, which was attempting to jumpstart its slipspace reactor. The surviving humans and a friendly Sangheili then attempted to destroy this proto-gravemind with a fragmentation grenade, but this only agitated the Flood. They were then set upon and forced to fight their way to the ship's escape pods. To ensure that the infection would not escape, the Red Horse launched a Shiva-class nuclear missile at the ship, seeming to eradicate the Flood. And as far as we know, this would mark the end of the Flood outbreak originating from Alpha Halo. In addition to the Flood containment facilities on Installation 04, the Forerunners would also choose to store specimens nearby on the gas mining facility suspended in the orbit of the gas giant known as Threshold. And in the time following its discovery, a Covenant artifact retrieval team was sent to the facility to explore the structure, soon discovering these specimens. Installation 04's Monitor 343 Guilty Spark would then reveal himself to these forces and inform their leader Sessa Refumi on the true purpose of these Halo rings. Now knowing that the Covenant religion was a lie, Refumi defected from the Empire and attempted to share this information with others, although the High Prophets were infuriated, and instead labeled him and those under his command heretics. A special operations team was then dispatched to silence Refumi and his followers, led by Ratas Vadumi and the now disgraced Arbiter Thel Vadami. Once inside the facility, Refumi would then release dormant flood forms onto the Spec Ops team, thinking that it would stall their mission. However, this plan backfired and a large number of his own troops were infected instead, with the outbreak quickly spreading to other portions of the facility. The Flood were unable to spread outside the station, however, as the Arbiter was able to sever a cable holding the station in orbit, which sent the mine plummeting into Threshold's liquid hydrogen core, promptly ending this Flood threat before it got completely out of hand. Unlike the relatively recent attempts by the Flood to escape containment, the Flood presence discovered on Installation 05 in 2552 may in fact be the oldest and longest-standing outbreak in history. This is because at some point around the year of 97,227 BCE, the Flood on Installation 05 escaped and evaded containment efforts due to negligence on the part of the installation's monitor 2401 Penitent Tangent. It is believed that the Flood's escape was either the result of a system malfunction or due to the meddling of an otherwise unknown visiting species. The Flood then spread rapidly in the area around the installation's library, but were kept relatively contained to this region once a sentinel wall was built around it. However, the Flood on the Ring were able to amass enough biomass to create a gravemind, and at some point after this, Penitent Tangent was captured and then held prisoner by the Flood. So without instruction from their monitor, the Sentinels would not perform properly, and many of the structures around the installation began to fall into disrepair. Even with the addition of Forerunner Aggressor Sentinels and Enforcers, the Flood remained a constant threat, albeit they were contained within the quarantine zone. Then in 2552, with the arrival of the Prophet of Regret's fleet and pursuing UNSC forces, the Flood was able to bolster its numbers considerably and redoubled its efforts against the Sentinels' defense measures. After it was learned that the Covenant intended to activate the Halo's firing sequence, the Master Chief was sent to neutralize the Prophet of Regret and a separate team to recover the Index before it fell into enemy hands. The Spartan was ultimately successful in his mission, but during his escape was taken prisoner by the Gravemind. Then in the hours following the Prophet of Regret's death, the Sangheili were held solely responsible for the tragedy, and so a changing of hands would take place, with many Jiralhane being elevated to positions traditionally held by the Sangheili. Despite this, the control of the ring remained a top priority, so the Arbiter and a group of Sangheili warriors were sent to launch a ground assault into the library's quarantine zone, and at the same time, the UNSC launched their own operation with the same purpose. But Miranda Keyes and Sergeant Major Avery Johnson would reach the Index first, although they would not have long to celebrate as the two were immediately ambushed by the Arbiter and Jiralhane reinforcements, with both the humans and the Index falling into Covenant hands. Just moments after this, the Arbiter would then be betrayed by Tartarus, chieftain of the Jiralhane, and left for dead. Deep behind enemy lines, he would be taken prisoner alongside the Master Chief, with the Gravemind attempting to educate the Sangheili on the true purpose of the Halo Rings. It did this through the use of the captured and now rampant Penitent Tangent and the revived corpse of the Prophet of Regret, with both revealing the lies of the Covenant religion, which broke the Arbiter's belief in the Great Journey. The Gravemind then tasked the Arbiter and Human with separate missions to help prevent the firing of the ring. As the Arbiter was sent to stop Covenant forces from taking control of the installation's control room, the Master Chief was sent directly to the Covenant's capital ship High Charity to directly pursue the Index. But in the time that they were held captive, the Prophet of Truth had called for the complete ejection of the Sangheili from the Covenant. This would manifest as the unprovoked slaughter of countless Sangheili at the hands of the Brutes and lead to a civil war known as the Great Schism. But to the detriment of all, this chaos would provide the Flood the perfect opportunity to infiltrate High Charity, and before long, they had completely gained control of the Covenant's capital ship, growing their forces exponentially. Happening at the same time, Tartarus and his Brutes were sent to the control room, intending to fire the Halo. Pursuing the Prophet of Truth as he attempted to flee from the now Flood-infested ship, the Master Chief would be forced to fight his way through Flood forces, and though he was conflicted on abandoning his allies and potentially allowing the Chieftain the opportunity to fire the Halo, his AI companion Cortana volunteered to stay behind and detonate the reactor of the Inember-clad as a failsafe, much like she did on Installation 04. And just moments before the Dreadnought departed, he made it on board, but Cortana was soon to be captured and taken prisoner by the Gravemind. Elsewhere on the ring, the surviving human and elite forces formed a tentative alliance, working together to neutralize remaining Covenant forces and breach the control room. Once inside, the Arbiter would attempt to reason with the Chieftain, but he was unreceptive. But through the combined efforts of the Arbiter and his new human allies, Tartarus was defeated, and the Index was retrieved just moments before the ring was fired. though this nearly complete firing sequence had triggered the other surviving Halo rings to enter standby status, enabling them to be fired remotely. This left the Alliance to believe that the Covenant had now set their sights on the Ark, and unknown to them, the Flood were soon to follow. Following the conclusion of the Battle of Voy on Earth, the Prophet of Truth's fleet would activate an ancient Forerunner slipspace portal called Accession hidden beneath the African continent, and use it to escape to Installation 00, otherwise known as the Ark. Just moments after this, a flood-infested Covenant cruiser that had broken through the Elite's blockade around High Charity emerged from slipspace into Earth's atmosphere. It then crash-landed into the city of Voy and quickly began infecting the local population. In order to prevent the Flood from escaping and spreading across the entire planet, Commander Miranda Keyes ordered the Master Chief to infiltrate the cruiser and detonate its reactors. He and the Arbiter Thalvadam then worked together to fight through a variety of flood forms, and were soon aided by the assault carrier Shadow of Intent, commanded by Ratos Vadum, who deployed his Sangheili task force. With the help of these Sangheili reinforcements, they were able to reach the crashed cruiser, and while inside, the Spartan discovered a broken message from his AI companion Cortana, who was still aboard High Charity. But with the Flood outbreak quickly getting out of control, their allied forces retreated from the area, and glassing efforts to eliminate the parasite began. Cortana's message was repaired by 343 Guilty Spark, which revealed she had found a solution to the Flood on the Ark. So the Allies rallied their forces and led a joint species operation through the Accession portal. On the Ark, the Sangheili human forces worked together to infiltrate several Forerunner shield control centers and lowered the shields surrounding the Ark's citadel. After successfully doing so, an infested High Charity emerged from slipspace and crashed into the Ark, releasing an army of Flood across the installation. But with the threat of Truth's Covenant activating the Halo Ray becoming more dire, the Gravemind ceased hostilities and offered to make a brief alliance with the Master Chief and Arbiter in order to stop the Prophet, providing Flood forces to reinforce their assault on the Citadel. Once Truth was stopped and then killed by the Arbiter, the Gravemind immediately betrayed the two and attempted to capture them. They were able to evade its grasp, and during their escape from the Flood, they even discovered a replacement Halo ring which had been constructed by the Ark, realizing that Cortana's plan all along was to fire the nearly complete installation to eradicate the Flood. But to do so, the Master Chief would need to retrieve his AI, forcing him to venture inside the wreckage of the Flood-infested High Charity. He then faced increasing numbers of Flood forces and the repeated telepathic demands from the Gravemind to stop, but the Master Chief was able to find and extract Cortana, who luckily still possessed the index from Installation 04. And in hopes of giving their forces more time to escape and delay the Flood, the Master Chief detonated High Charity's reactors, severely damaging the Gravemind, while the Spartan, Cortana, and the Arbiter all escaped. The team, now aided by Sergeant Johnson, made their way onto Installation 08's surface, while the remaining humans and Sangheili retreated back through the portal to Earth. However, the Gravemind had survived High Charity's destruction and moved itself to the new ring to recover while the Flood began to spread. Aided by Sentinels controlled by 343 Guilty Spark, the Chief, Johnson, and Arbiter were able to reach the control room. However, as firing the ring prematurely would destroy it and severely damage the Ark, the Monitor turned on the three. The Spartan was able to seemingly destroy Spark, but Sergeant Johnson had been mortally wounded and soon died from his injuries. In the moments following his death, they activated the ring's firing sequence. The installation was then destroyed from the firing, and the Ark did suffer heavy damage. This caused the Accession portal to collapse just as the Chief and Arbiter were escaping aboard the UNSC Forward unto Dawn. However, the section of the ship that the Master Chief was on was cut off by this unstable portal closure, leaving him stranded in deep space. But for now, his sacrifice had meant that the Flood outbreak on the Ark had been stopped. While the Gravemind had been destroyed from the firing of Installation 08, and all Flood on the Ark appeared to have been eradicated, the Flood still existed on the other Halo rings and other Forerunner installations. This led the UNSC to begin making preparations for the possibility of the Flood's return, although they did choose to keep the Flood's existence a secret to the general population. But within the military, specialized wargame simulations would be created that framed the possible return of the Flood. Spartan 4s would even volunteer to join fire teams specifically focused on combating Flood outbreaks, with several that occurred following the end of the war having been successfully contained due to their actions. The UNSC had also diverted resources to the development of the Hazop Cyclops, specifically dedicated to fighting the Flood threat, as well as a Flood variant of Visor, given to Spartan personnel who engaged in Flood contamination duties. A briefing on the Flood was also included in the Spartan Field Manual, which details key protocols such as Emergency Contact Protocol Upsilon, as well as Corruptor, with Upsilon being declared in order to quarantine a Flood outbreak, and Corruptor being the declaration that a Spartan has been infected by the Flood and that the immediate nuclear bombardment of the area must be authorized. Additionally, it is known that 3 days after the Battle of the Ark, some flood spores had survived the destruction of High Charity's reactors and the firing of Installation 08. So the Ark's monitor, 000 Tragic Solitude, had sealed off the Covenant capital city with a containment shield, ordering sentinels to establish a perimeter and render the surrounding area uninhabitable so that no sentient life would survive within the immediate vicinity. Not only to keep the flood contained, but also to defend against any future outsiders who would foolishly try to access the wreckage and unleash the flood. Then in October of 2556, during a joint mining operation led by Imbrium Machine Complex and the BXR Mining Corporation, miners at Site-22 would unearth a Forerunner starship buried within the asteroid LV-31. And much to their horror, they would stumble upon long-dormant flood within the ship, which quickly overwhelmed their personnel. And upon learning of the flood's presence, the nearby frigate UNSC Saturn's shipboard AI Lycaon insisted that the ship's captain, Pedro Alvarez, enact Upsilon Protocol and withdraw their forces to contain the infestation. But unwilling to lose the much-needed resources that the asteroid was producing, Alvarez would instead deactivate Lycaon and ordered Spartan Fire Team Leviathan and supporting UNSC forces to go groundside and engage the flood directly. However, these deployed Spartans and Hellbringers were quickly overwhelmed, with nearly everyone, including the 4 Spartans, falling to the flood. And worst of all, one of the Spartans were even infected, as the countermeasures within their Mjolnir were unable to terminate the Spartan in time. Ultimately, the captain was left with no other choice but to activate Upsilon and Corruptor protocols, ordering all survivors to retreat to the Saturn before they unleashed a barrage of Shiva-class nuclear missiles. The asteroid and the majority of the flood were destroyed in the process. However, a single slipspace-capable Condor was commandeered by the flood, allowing the infected Spartan and several other flood forms to escape. Shortly after evading their destruction, that very Condor crash-landed on the backwater planet of Atropos, which was home to a small population of isolated humans and a previously exiled group of flood-worshipping Covenant fanatics known as the Governors of Contrition. This crash would soon be discovered by the Governor's Sanchayum leader, Kanto Bereft. After finding that the flood forms on board were heavily damaged from the crash, he had moved them to a long-abandoned citadel so that they could recover. He then had his followers dismantle their orbital station to live on the surface, then manipulating them into willingly sacrificing themselves to the flood, slowly allowing the parasite to build its numbers. And upon the sacrifice of his final tribute, these flood rallied their forces and broke free from the citadel. It wasn't long before the flood had consumed all life on the planet, and the last surviving being was none other than Kanto Bereft himself. But before offering himself over to the flood, the Sanchayum had left a recording noting that rather than devoting their resources to the development of a proto-gravemind, the flood had formed some sort of transmitter or scanner. And while it is unclear what exactly it was, they seem to be searching for something, somewhere, out in the stars. The most recently observed flood activity took place in 2559 on the Ark, following the last known major conflict between the Banished and UNSC forces. And after the loss of their only assault carrier, Enduring Conviction, Jiralhane such as the brothers Pavium and Voridus were tasked to salvage the area around High Charity for weapons to use in the ongoing conflict against the humans. The Banished leader Atriox, aware that the flood might have survived its destruction several years prior, gave specific orders to only scout the surrounding area, and not to go inside. However, Voridus, like many of the Banished, did not take the threat of the flood seriously, believing it to be Covenant propaganda and yet another of the Prophet's many lies. So, ignoring the warnings of both Atriox and his own brother, Voridus deactivated the Ark's Sentinel defense network and used a Baruch Kaza workshop Scarab to break through the containment shield around High Charity. Voridus then sent troops inside the wreckage to assess, but they were then ambushed by swarms of flood infection forms. The flood then rushed to escape confinement, and with the Sentinel's defense network now deactivated, the flood spread nearly unchallenged. Although suffering heavy losses, Pavium was able to rescue his brother Voridus from the overwhelming flood forces and regrouped at a Banished drilling site near a Forerunner archive. And using the unstable terrain to their advantage, Pavium was able to trigger a chain reaction with Banished drills that burned away much of the local flood, allowing Voridus to enter the archive and reactivate the Sentinel's defense network. However, by this time, the flood had already formed a massive proto-gravemind near High Charity that was not far off from evolving into a fully fledged gravemind. But with support from the Ark's defenses, especially a massive Retriever Sentinel, the proto-gravemind was destroyed before it could fully mature. The Banished then began to work alongside thousands of Sentinels to contain the rest of this infestation, and to our understanding, may have come close to eradicating the parasite on the Ark once and for all. And with that, we have covered everything from the Flood's origins and ancient history to their most recent outbreaks and even their second defeat on the Ark. Whether or not they'll be making a return in the next Halo game is unclear, but if there's anything that you can take away from today's video, it's that the Flood is an incredibly resilient enemy that pops up when you least expect it. And if you ask me, it's only a matter of time before they find what it is that they were looking for on Atropos and make another attempt at consuming all life in the galaxy. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you want to see more Halo lore. And be sure to turn on your notifications because you'll want to know when I post my next video, the long-awaited species profile on the Flood. Today's video is actually taken from the history section of that larger video, but I thought I'd give you this one as a little teaser to hold you over until its full release in December. But hey, that's it for today, so I'll see you in the next video. Oh, and hey, if you're looking for something else to watch, be sure to look at the 2 videos on your screen now.